In the summer of 2019, I was staying at my grandfather's farm alone for a few nights while my grandparents were out of town. It was an easy job, and I was being paid just to make sure the place was looked after. On the last night, I was sitting in the living room watching TV when I heard a strange noise outside near the cornfield. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was probably just a deer passing through. But then I heard all the cows mooing at the same time. Normally, you'd hear one cow mooing here or there, but for all of them to start at once, something was definitely wrong. The cows sounded scared. I realized it was my responsibility to check what was going on, being the only person at the farm. I put on my jacket and walked towards the door, hesitating as I reached for the handle. Suddenly, I heard a sharp, high-pitched scream from one of the cows. My heart raced, and I stood frozen for a moment, the noise echoing through the night air. Whatever was out there was causing chaos. I rushed upstairs to my grandfather's room, where he kept a hunting rifle under the bed. Grabbing the gun, I loaded it and headed outside. The cows were still mooing frantically. I made my way to the barn to check on them. Inside the barn, nothing seemed unusual at first glance, but as I walked further in, I noticed that one cow was missing from its stall. It didn't make any sense it had been tied up earlier. I stepped outside to the edge of the field, and that's when I heard faint voices. It sounded like whispering, coming from the cornfield. Nervous, I fired 2 rounds into the air. Immediately, everything fell silent. The cows stopped mooing, and the whispers from the field disappeared. I stood there, gun in hand, listening to the eerie quietness. Then I heard footsteps, getting closer from inside the cornfield. Despite my fear, I knew I couldn't just hide. This is exactly why farmers have guns. I walked into the cornfield, my heart pounding. The further I went, the louder the footsteps became, and then I saw him, a figure dressed entirely in black, standing just a few feet away from me. I raised my rifle and shouted for him to get out of the field, but he didn't move. I fired another shot into the air, hoping to scare him off, but he remained motionless. Then, he began walking towards me, his arms slightly raised as if to tell me to lower my gun. I screamed at him to stop, aiming my gun directly at him. That's when I noticed I wasn't alone. There were at least 6 or 7 other figures, all dressed in black and wearing creepy masks, standing among the rows of corn. Fear gripped me as I realized I was surrounded. The man continued walking towards me, and the group began chanting something in a language I couldn't understand. It sounded almost like a song. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran as fast as I could, crashing through the corn until I was out of breath. I stopped, turned around, and fired several rounds in their direction. I could hear them scattering, footsteps retreating deeper into the field. Panting, I ran back towards the farmhouse. That's when I saw it on the ground in front of me. There was a cow's head, placed in the center of a circle of candles. I gagged at the sight, barely able to control my nausea. Once inside, I grabbed the phone and called the police. I told the operator everything as best as I could. She assured me that an officer was on the way. I then called my parents, explaining the situation. My dad said he'd come to pick me up in an hour. I went upstairs to my grandfather's room, still shaking with fear. It felt like hours had passed before I finally heard the sound of a police car pulling up outside. I ran to the officer, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. The officer searched the barn and part of the cornfield. He found the cow's head, just as I had described, and called in a search team. It was now an active crime scene. When my parents arrived, I talked to the officer along with them about everything that had happened. After that, my grandparents took things seriously. They installed high-tech security cameras all around the farm. We never found out who the group was or why they chose to perform an animal sacrifice at the farm. I just happened to be the unlucky one home alone that night. My name is Howard, and I'm 25 years old. I live on my family's farm and help take care of it when my parents are out of town. It's just a small family farm, not a commercial one or anything like that. My parents want me to take it over when they're too old to manage it, since I'm the oldest of three and the only son. But honestly, I don't see myself staying here in the middle of Arkansas for the rest of my life, especially after something strange that happened last July. My parents went on a romantic trip for a week, leaving me and my two sisters, Crystal and Morgan, in charge of the property. There's not much around here, plenty of privacy, maybe even too much if you ask me. But on one night, that privacy was shattered. It was getting late, close to bedtime. Crystal, who takes summer courses online, was in her room working on her laptop. Morgan and I were hanging out in the living room, watching some dumb show on TV. All of us kind of want to get away from the farm life, especially me since I'm in the prime of my 20s. One of the downsides of living on a farm is dealing with predators, not just the kind that attack your crops or livestock, but sometimes people who come to steal. It doesn't happen often, but it has before. We keep a few guns in the house just in case. That night, our two dogs suddenly started barking like crazy outside. Something had definitely spooked them. I went out to the backyard to see what was going on, and the dogs were both staring at the crops, barking nonstop. I told them to shut up, and they quieted down, but I stood there listening. That's when I heard it, a human whistle coming from the cornfield. This was the first time I had to deal with a trespasser on the property without my dad being around. My first instinct was to grab one of the guns from inside the house. The dogs started barking again, and I told my sisters someone was outside in the cornfield. They both said it was a bad idea to go running into the dark field alone, and I quickly realized they were right. The thought of it terrified me, so instead, I went back outside with the dogs. They were barking wildly, facing the crops. I raised the gun and fired a shot into the air, hoping it would scare whoever it was away. The sound echoed into the night, and the dogs went quiet. I yelled for the trespasser to get off our land and then headed back inside, thinking that would do the trick. My sisters and I laughed a little, thinking it was over. But soon enough, the dogs started going crazy again, even louder this time. I grabbed the gun and went back outside. My heart almost stopped when I saw him, a man, standing about 20 feet from the dogs, just outside the cornfield, staring at me. I shouted at him, and he ran into the field. I chased after him and fired another shot into the air, but I stopped short. There was no way I was going in there. I decided to bring the dogs inside. I told my sisters what happened, and we called our dad. He told me I had to be the man of the house and protect my sisters. He also suggested firing another warning shot if the trespasser came back. We eventually all went to our rooms, each of my sisters taking one of the dogs. I kept the gun in my room, just in case. I lay in bed watching a movie on my laptop when I heard it again, the same whistle, coming from outside. I jumped out of bed and looked out the window. There he was, slowly walking through the grass. He stopped and looked right at my window, still whistling. This guy was clearly messing with us, trying to scare us, which was a really stupid move considering I had a gun. I grabbed it, aimed at the ground near him, and fired. He immediately stopped his act and ran off, disappearing towards the front of the house. He didn't come back after that. I told my sisters what happened, and we agreed he wouldn't be returning. We never found out who it was or why he was there. It could have been some kids trying to scare us for fun, or it could have been someone dangerous. I guess we'll never know. It was a quiet autumn night, with light rain tapping gently against the windows, filling the house with the earthy smell of damp soil. My partner and I had spent a busy day working on the farm, and now we could finally enjoy a moment of peace in front of the fireplace. Candlelight flickered on the table, the flames in the fireplace crackled softly, and we leaned back on the sofa, savoring this rare moment of relaxation. The night was deep, and the silence around us felt almost too quiet, broken only by the rustling of the wind through the wheat fields. I thought this night would pass peacefully, like so many others on the farm, but things quickly took a turn. Around midnight, there was a sudden knock at the door. In this remote place, it was highly unusual for anyone to knock at such an hour. We exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in our eyes. "Who could it be at this time?" my partner whispered. "Who do you think it is?" I stood up, a sense of unease creeping in as I walked toward the door. I didn't open it right away, instead asking through the crack, "Who's there?" A man's voice responded from outside, sounding somewhat anxious. "Please open the door. I'm lost and just need to use the phone." His voice carried a hint of urgency. Feeling cautious, I asked, "Are you alone?" There was a brief silence before the voice responded, somewhat vaguely, "I'm with a friend. He's in the car." This answer made me even more cautious. Why would the friend stay in the car instead of coming with him? The voice also seemed tense, as if trying to hide something. A sense of unease grew inside me. I didn't continue the conversation, instead moving quietly to the window to try and see what was happening outside. But it was pitch dark, and the rain blurred my view.